Good afternoon, and welcome to Landmark Center. It's a great day for a story. My name is J.B. Eckert. So I'll tell you what, you sit down, and I will too. And we'll open this Christmas storybook and see what story it is today. Today's story is about something that happened a long, long time ago, and it is based in historic fact. Someone will call it historic fiction, but almost everything in it is true, all right? And this story is called Mr. Macy and the Christmas Conundrum. It begins in December of 1862 in New York City, the home of Roland H. Macy. It's the second week of the Christmas month, and it is bitterly cold. The war with the Southern Confederacy, an effort the North assumed would be short, has now dragged on for nearly 2 years. The North is doing poorly. President Lincoln has extended the initial volunteer enlistment from 3 months to 3 years, and he needs more soldiers. New York City is as politically divided as the rest of the country, as many favoring the South as the North. It's also America's largest metropolis, and it continues to grow, welcoming immigrants, Irish and German mostly, poor most assuredly. Merchant emigre Roland H. Macy from Nantucket Island in the Northeast Atlantic arrived a few years ago. He was hoping that this time New York would make him successful. With his wife and 2 children, the Macys reside in a warm and comfy home at 332 South 6th Street. The grandfather clock in the Macy front hall has just struck 6 p.m. It's dinner time, and the family is seated at the table. Except Mr. Macy. The head of this family is not hungry. Standing by the clock and putting on his coat, Mr. Macy is just plain angry. "How could she do that to me?" he roared at his wife. "Now, Roland," Mrs. Macy called, rising from her place at the table, "she's the best one you've hired so far. You've said so yourself." "I understand that, but Louisa," Roland Macy's hat and one glove on, "how could she put me in such a spot? It's almost ruined us before." "That was 8 years ago," Mrs. Macy reminded him as she approached. "Times were different then. Now, everyone in 1862 celebrates Christmas. And besides," she added, stepping to him, reaching out for his arms, "ours wasn't the only store that was nearly forced to close in Haverhill." "But it was our 4th attempt," he began. "You ordered too much, Roland," she reminded him. "You weren't familiar with the products back then, and I'm not familiar with Christmas gifts now. In fact, I don't even know what she's purchased." To himself, Roland Macy discreetly added, "Give a woman a little authority and look where she's put me." "Maybe it's not her fault," suggested Mrs. Macy. "Maybe the newspaper editor wrote the headline." "Who wrote the headline is not the problem," Mr. Macy replied. "It's what the headline says, and I quote to you, 'Come see something the world has never before seen at R.H. Macy number 204 and 206 and very soon 208 6th Avenue. "Well, maybe she's got an idea," Mr. Macy said as he started down the sidewalk to his store that cold winter night. "Because," he added to himself, "I surely don't." The she Mr. Macy was referring to was a young woman named Margaret Swain Getchell. She was just 20 years old when she entered the R.H. Macy store the year before. She was looking for a job. The teaching position she had in Richmond, Virginia, evaporated when the threat of civil war eliminated it. So she came north, seeking employment, finally meeting Mr. Macy. It wasn't because they both came from Nantucket or that they were very distant, several times removed cousins. It was because in her Macy saw something very special. She had a knack for numbers. Very soon it was discovered for the retail business as well. She moved quickly from her first cashier position to selecting goods for sale to the store to offering idea after idea for things to sell and ways to promote them. Macy's was growing. It had filled one store and opened the second in a building right next to the first, and now Macy's was poised to open a third store in the building next to the second. Margaret had arrived and actually implored Roland to stock it with goods he usually didn't. Clothing, toiletries, hats, jewelry, clocks, even and especially toys. The very same things that almost ruined Roland Macy's retail in Haverhill. The store was dark and closed when Mr. Macy arrived. He pulled from his coat a ring of keys, selected one, and noisily inserted it into the front door's lock. Rudolph, the night watchman, and the woman in Macy's immediate thoughts, Margaret Getchell, heard the noise. They were organizing, placing, and in some cases assembling products in the new toy department that was still unopened in Macy's this new third store. Rudolph was a large, robust German, an immigrant, and one of Mr. Macy's very first hires. Rudolph lived in the store. No thief again would cut a hole in the ceiling and steal $1,500 worth of fabric, as had George Van Ness 2 months after the store opened, and nor would a fire ever consume anything, as it had started to do 3 years before this. No. Rudolph lived in the store, ready to call for help. More than that, Rudolph was dedicated to Margaret Getchell. Rudolph turned down their lamp, quietly crept to the door that separated the new from the current. "It's Mr. Macy." Margaret turned from Rudolph, her face in her hands. She had avoided the owner that whole day, the day the infamous "something in the world has never before seen" advertisement had appeared. Now Mr. Macy was here. Oh, she had heard he was upset about that ad, but she knew she had not provided the headline. But maybe now, with the store closed and just she and he, Margaret could face the owner and address the issue. She straightened up, threw back her shoulders, turned, pushed past Rudolph, opened the door, marched into the darkened store, down one of the aisles toward Mr. Macy's back wall office. Her walk was determined, her countenance firm, her conviction strong, until she got to the door, and then determination and conviction evaporated. She stood for a moment, looking through the window at Mr. Macy, a man just a little taller than he was wide, sitting on a pillow on his chair behind his desk, ledger books spread out before him. She watched as his gaze followed his finger as it slid down a vertical line of numbers and then stopped at the bottom. Numbers were not on his mind, however, because as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes wandered back up the list of numbers, past the top of the list, past the top of the ledger book, past the sundries on his desk, and up to the window of his office that looked out on the sales floor, and to Miss Getchell's face looking in at him. There was a moment of silence before both realized they were actually seeing each other. Miss Getchell? Mr. Macy. Mr. Macy, come in here, Miss Getchell, the owner commanded. "And tell me why you're here. It's not safe for you at night." "My apartment is just across the street, Mr. Macy," she countered, opening the office door. Before she could continue, "Miss Getchell, I'm glad you're here, because I really want to talk to you about the ad." She quickly finished his thought as she slipped in the door, stood in front of a closet, or closest chair. "I know, Mr. Macy, but I didn't say anything. How did they? I was dictating sale items to be listed in today's ad, and I must have been most likely," she was stammering now. would have something the world has never before seen. Mr. Macy finished her thought. Oh, Miss Getchell. And he pointed a finger at the chair behind her. She closed the door and sat, folded hands on her lap, trying not to look directly at him. Have you talked to Mr. Barnum? She suggested very quietly and very tentatively. Phineas Taylor Barnum and Roland Husey Macy had become very good and honest friends. Mr. Barnum finally emerged from debt, regained control of his museum and his future. He stopped in frequently to see what was new and just to talk. Be careful of P.T., Macy warned. He prevaricates to get people into his theater or museum. Yes, but once inside, Miss Getchell countered. I mean, he prints the real things, doesn't he? Yeah, if you consider teaching a 4-year-old midget boy how to act like a man and smoke cigars and then pass him off as the smallest man on the planet. There was a pause. Miss Getchell, I know you didn't mean it, but I really don't know what we're going to do. It was the next morning. Store had just opened. Few shoppers were already studying the merchandise when a huge, loud, masculine voice ruptured the dignified cry, "Touch that velocity and your ears will fall off!" The voice came from outside Macy's front door. Everyone inside looked outside to see who made the declaration. There was no need to wonder, because a moment later in strode P.T. Barnum, tall, clean-shaven, prosperous. Outside, resting against the wall of Macy's front door, was a new, high-wheeled bicycle, the newest craze sweeping the affluent. Where did all those indecorous ruffians originate? Barnum bellowed as he strode down the aisle, referring to that gaggle of children that had suddenly materialized around his mechanical contrivance. "And where's my bird?" he demanded. Mr. Barnum, please," Margaret Getchell came, a wild, feminine voice to calm the entrepreneur. "Well, Miss Getchell," Barnum loudly voiced, "wherein lies that iconic mechanistic device, that mechanical endothermic flapping vertebrate? Has it been resuscitated and ready to enchant us all?" And his arms flailed high to encompass the whole store. "With a concert?" From the rear of the store, on the arm of Miss Getchell, appeared a large, flapping, somewhat singing, mechanical bird. Business at R.H. Macy's stopped. People from all over the two stores converged on Miss Getchell as she and her mechanical contrivance moved toward the glove department at the front of the store. As much as Mr. Barnum loved to see that bird work, this day he was more interested in talking to Mr. Macy. Through the crowd he had gathered, and between the counters, barring his way, a wriggling Mr. Barnum finally arrived at Mr. Macy's office. The two friends were surprisingly very honest with each other. "Friend Macy," Barnum said, bursting into Macy's office, Thank you, I'll take 3 pair, and I know you have them." "Phineas, what is it that you want 3 pair of?" Macy asked Barnum, as Barnum sat in a chair opposite the storekeeper. Leaning toward Macy, P.T. described 3 pair of those new tan lace-up shoes. "And you do have them, don't you? Because I told Mr. Stewart you'd have them." "You went to the competition? To the Marble Palace, Mr. Barnum?" "It's a long block, friend Macy. The biggest department store there is in New York. For now," Mr. Macy countered. "You keep thinking big, Roland. Think is an action word." "Really?" Macy incredulously replied. "They're supposed to be more comfortable than the boots we usually wear," P.T. continued. "What are?" Macy asked. The shoes, friend Roland. Where's your mind today? Certainly isn't on sales. I'm just going to wear them in the museum, not going to expose them to all the horse droppings and the garbage everyone tosses in the street. You know, said Barnum, leaning further toward Macy with a serious expression on his face, I've been meaning to tell the mayor to pass some laws to stop people from dumping their waste in the street and to sweep up after the horses. Someday, Roland Macy said, leaning toward his friends, you're going to run for government office again, aren't you? As soon as I find out what it is that the world has never before seen. Roland Macy stood up, walked around to the front of his desk, and sat on the edge nearest P.T. Barnum. Showman leaned back, slapped Macy's knees. You've got better publicity than we have at the Barnum American Museum just up the street. So tell me, he said, leaning toward the mercantilist, what is it that we've never before seen? The store owner looked at his friend and after a slight pause said in a quiet, almost ashamed voice, I don't know, Phineas. I just really don't know. The next day, Macy's ad in the New York Daily Tribune made no response of the never-before-seen occurrence just 8 days' distance. But there was an editorial supporting Mayor Fernando Wood's suggestion that New York leave the Union, become the Republic of New York. The Macy ad the next day also failed to mention the event, but the lack of mention didn't quell the number of customers who stopped in the store asking about what the event might be. Indeed, anticipation was building, and Mr. Macy and Margaret Getchell were still without any inkling of what it would be. And the big event was just 7 days away. Macy's was slowly but surely becoming a destination for new products, not sold at other stores. Please, ladies, please return to your station, Margaret Getchell loudly pleaded. We have other customers. But the sales ladies of Macy's were focused on one customer, a man, a thespian by vocation, Shakespearean actor by choice. A veritable sensation, the New York Herald newspaper heralded. The toast of New York's theater scene, raved another. A very good-looking young man with a slight Southern accent. His name was John Wilkes Booth. He was guided in a walk through the store by Margaret Getchell. She said he asked what the thing the world has never seen before was, and would it be military in nature. The Gatling gun had just been introduced, and the Union was seeking companies that could produce it. Margaret also noted that young Booth never smiled. But was most troubling about his visit, other than his focus on war and politics, was not the siphoning of sales ladies from the business floor, but the sporadic coughing fits the young artist endured. After nearly an hour of upending the day's sales activities, John Wilkes Booth departed, leaving a few autographed flyers for his play, Richard III. 6 days and counting. Margaret Swain Mitchell has an idea. Now she knows what the world has never before seen. In Mr. Macy's office, the door closed to the outside world, she explains her concept. Mr. Macy, seated behind his desk, looks concerned. The explanation continues. She can detect a grin forming on the owner's face. She continues. He leans forward, listening intently. She finishes with a burst of upward flailing arms. He stands from his chair, a huge smile. He shakes her hand. She opens his office door, grabs her coat, and as she runs past the cashier's quay, lopes down the various store aisles to charge out the front door of Macy's main store, destination unknown. Before this particular day was half done, a young artist entered the store. Macy's had seen his work, many had seen his work, and his very presence soon siphoned more sales ladies and customers alike to gather in groups to speculate as to his name and his reason for being at Macy's. "It was too," Thomas Nast, one of the sales ladies, adamantly responded to her customer. "He's an artist. He draws news pictures of events for those illustrated news magazines." "Well, what was he looking for?" inquired one from the crowd. "Something special for his wife," Mr. Macy said as he walked up to dispel the gathering, congesting the selling floor. "She's in a delicate condition," he whispered to the group, "with their first child." But before the group dissolved, the sale lady excitedly added, "He almost left a drawing, but I caught up with him before he departed." "And what was the drawing of?" one onlooker questioned. "An old man. It looked like Mr. Riley in the basement." "You have a lot of older gentlemen in the basement," Mr. Macy said. "They unpack all the merchandise that arrives and mark prices on each. Most are immigrants from all over the world." And Mr. Macy sounded proud. "Nast has been here a couple of times, drawn images of a number of men." Just before noon, on the 5th day before the grand reveal, the new toy room secret was under threat. A crowd of ragged children from the 5-Point District were pushing and shoving, trying to squeeze past Rudolph, to push into that clandestine secret changer. But Rudolph wasn't budging. With his arms spread wide, he was trying to sweep the youngsters out of the store. And just then, Mr. Macy and Margaret Getchell emerged from the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. "They're from all points, Mr. Macy," came Margaret Getchell's response. The store owner noted a touch of compassion in her voice. 5 Points was a territory of the worst tenements in New York City. It was named after the place through which 5 city streets passed. It was where the poorest free and runaway black people lived among the poorest huge new surge of Irish immigrants. 5 Points had front and rear house tenements that doubled the allowable structures on each city lot, which meant many dwellings were cut off from most of the day's sun and of sufficient fresh air. Drinkable water was always wanting, and water closets were both insufficient for the occupants and unsanitary, with some of their contents leaching into the streets. We're sorry, Mr. Macy." Strong, rich Irish accented voice behind the youngsters came from a lady a little taller than the storekeeper. "These be our charges from the Church of the Transfiguration up on Martin Cross Street," she continued. We were on an outing, for some exercise, and they seem to have gotten away from us. The woman moved through the children to stand beside the merchant. "Underway," she ordered, pointing behind the youngsters into the next store and toward the front door. "Back to church with ye and back to school." Children turned, began shuffling through the second, and then into the first, and then the original store. Margaret Getchell raised the hem of her skirt and made a dash to the front door, running up the aisle parallel to the existing children. And before the exodus reached the front door, Margaret Getchell was there, a little out of breath. "At 1 p.m., 5 days from now," she announced, "you'll please come back and be the first to enter Mr. Macy's brand new toy department." There was a momentary silence, and then screams of delight and leaping bodies in the aisle of R.H. Macy Dry Goods Store number 204 and 206, and very soon 208 6th Avenue. 2 days before the new toy store opening, the New York Daily Tribune and other papers were filled with the latest war news. Not enough men were volunteering for the Union. The specter of conscription was becoming more real. Some penny newspaper editorialists vigorously continued their criticism of President Lincoln for his emancipation of Southern slaves. Blockades remained effective. Citizens continued to live with few less of everything. But mostly the stories were about New York's 69th Infantry at Fredericksburg. Nearly every man in the unit was killed, wounded, or missing. And while the 69th was the hardest hit, the death toll of New Yorkers in 70 other infantry regiments and 26 cavalry, artillery, engineer units also fighting at Fredericksburg was horribly high. In total, during that battle, New York lost 2,807 men. Mr. Macy hadn't slept well. Margaret Getchell hadn't slept well. Rudolph hadn't slept well. There was worry enough for everyone. 9 a.m., the morning of the great reveal, the entire staff was assembled on the selling floor. Mr. Macy looked at each of the sales ladies. He knew them all by name. And then he moved through the group to the few men that were standing in the shadows and brought them forward into the rest of the crowd. These men, Roland Macy introduced to the sales floor staff, work in the basement, unpacking product, marking each for sale. They are important. And then he swung around to look at everyone. You may not know them, but if they are not doing their jobs, you can't do yours. All of you. And Mr. Macy paused to look at each and every employee on the sales floor that morning. Each and every one of you is important, he said. You. And he swept his arms over the gathering. Make this store work. Thank you. Margaret Getchell was standing next to Roland, opened the newspaper to the Macy ad and read it verbatim. 1 p.m., the brand new Macy toy department will be unveiled. The rest of the ad contained items and prices. She closed the newspaper, folded it, placed it under her arm. She looked to the group. The newspaper men would be here half an hour before 1, and the children from the Church of the Transfiguration. They should arrive just before the door to the toy department was open. The church children and any other children that arrive that day are to be given small canes of peppermint in the jars that you'll find behind the counter, she continued. And there was a pause. And then Margaret looked at everyone and said, it's going to be a busy day at Macy's. 11 o'clock, the salespeople and the men from the basement who had volunteered to be what no one had ever before seen started into the toy store to begin their transformation. In a couple of hours, what Margaret Getchell had envisioned would become reality. The newspaper men arrived early, of course, and were ushered into the new department. Just after 12:30, the children from 5 Point arrived. They, too, were early. Mr. Macy greeted each of them, handing each a peppermint cane. He was surprised to see that each had washed faces and somewhat clean hands. They stood by the door, giving names to reporters and answers to questions. And then, at 1 p.m. exactly, the doors flew open. Before the wondering eyes of the invited stood a witch and a bishop and Father Frost and a Chinese father and a dozen more foreign entities, all bringers of gift to children at the holiday. From the past 5 days, Margaret Getchell had visited all the immigrant communities she knew in New York City, and from them she had collected clothing representative of their homelands. Spread throughout the new toy department were the places where each of the Macy volunteer salespeople and men from the basement would sit in their borrowed clothing, each representing a giver of Christmas gifts from their respective country. From Germany, there was Wignoxstammen, the Green Man. From Chile, El Viejito Pesquero, the Easter Old Man. Father Christmas came from England. A witch from Italy, La Befana. Grandfather Frost from Russia, China's Sengenlorian, an old man. It was indeed a gathering the world has never before seen. Margaret had done a wonderful job. The room was painted white, even the ceiling. The stone floor of the building had been scrubbed. There were bundles of bright flowers scattered throughout the room, and wreaths and Christmas trees. There were mechanical toys and holding dolls and toys made of metal and wood. There were toys that moved and made noise. There were games of many pieces and games of few pieces. There were boy-sized baseball uniforms labeled with the name of the Silver Ball champions, the Brooklyn Eckfords. There was also the uniform of a Union corporal, downsized to a 10-year-old size. There were girl dresses, accentuating the child's posterior, as was the trend among the ladies of the time. And this, the reporter mentioned toward the toy department, is the something the world has never seen before? Never before, said a visitor, big voice, a man named P.T. Barnum, and in his loudest talking voice continued, never before have the world's gift bringers ever been assembled in one place. Where is Santa Claus? A little boy approached the mercantilist. My daddy says Santa Claus brings our gifts here in America. Where is he? Mr. Barnum looked at Mr. Macy. The reporters looked at Mr. Macy. The little boy and the little girl, and now several more, strolled over, all looking for the same answer. The sea of faces soon surrounded Roland Husey Macy and Phineas Taylor Barnum, familiar neighborhood voices, as well as faces from Transfiguration Church, black faces, white faces, faces mostly clean and hair mostly combed, faces and more faces, all asking the same huge question. Well, began the store owner, as he scanned the room for rescue. Barely a whisper was heard among the children. Reporters from the city's papers and magazines stood, pencils poised above notebooks. Even the adults in the room squeezed closer to hear the explanation. Santa's something we write about, Mr. Macy began, less than confidently. And, well, you've seen some sketches of Santa. But until this day, have you ever seen the actual person? The voice came from behind the crowd. Tucking his drawing pad under his arm and his pencils into his vest pocket, Tom Nance sauntered through the crowd to stand by the merchant. Ladies and gentlemen, what did the ad say? That we'd see something the world has never before seen. Is that correct? And the crowd assembled shouted with one loud voice, it is! Well, look to your right. Everyone turned to the arch that divided store 2 from the new store 3, and the voice continued, the R.H. Macy Dealer in Dry Goods, Carpets, Oilcloths, and Matting Store, numbers 204, 206, and now 207, 208, Mr. Macy quickly corrected, 208 6th Avenue, are proud to present a sight truly the world has never before seen. A walking, talking, ho, 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 came a loud exclamation as Santa Claus himself strode around the corner of the new doorway into the new 3rd store. He marched directly into the crowd that had accumulated to be in front of Mr. Macy. With a very loud and a very Irish, Merry Christmas! He walked directly into the new toy department, followed like the mice to a piper, the children of 5 Points, and everyone in New York who had come to see something never before seen. P.T. Barnum and Roland Macy stood together watching the crowd, like a wave spent recede into the new department. I got to admit, Roland, you really did it. Phineas Taylor put his arm around the shorter man's shoulders and in a quiet voice whispered, "This really is something the world's never seen before." He looked down at his very good friend and added, "You had this all figured out before, didn't you? You old sneak." And Mr. Barnum gave Mr. Macy such a slap on the back, the storekeeper's glasses nearly fell off. It was evening of the next day. Mrs. Macy sat wriggling, trying to find that sweet spot in the sofa as she sat before a warm fire burning in the front room hearth. She was watching the flames, but imagining the pictures described in the newspaper article Roland Macy was reading. She was smiling. "Go back, Roland." She leaned back from the fire to her husband, who stood behind her holding the New York Daily Times newspaper. "You have the world's gift givers, but you didn't have ours?" "Well, there never was a real human being one. I mean, just sketches and poems and books, but not the real one." "No, not until yesterday, Mrs. Macy. Not until yesterday." "Roland," Mrs. Macy turned from the fire and touched her husband's hand. "Who was the young man? And how did he know about Santa Claus?" "The young man was Thomas Nast, newspaper illustrator. He was doing some sketches of the unveiling Margaret had asked him to do." "But where did he find Santa Claus?" "In the basement. Tom had been in the store several times, did some sketches, saw a lot of our staff, even the men in the basement. One place with the men from all over the world. Tom had sketched this one, short, round Irish man with a full beard who really knew only 2 words, which were, 'Merry Christmas,'" Mrs. Macy proposed. Mr. Macy nodded. Margaret wrapped him in a new fur-trimmed red lady's coat right off the rack, pulled a stocking cap from a mannequin, buckled a large horse's cinch belt around his waist, gave him a pipe despite the fact he doesn't smoke, borrowed some glasses, and ran Odell Quentin O'Reilly to the floor. They put him on a big chair, and young Nast would sketch a picture of the youngster or an adult with Santa. And Mr. O'Reilly would smile and laugh and nod, and when the visitor left, he would call out, "Merry Christmas." She finished her husband's sentence again. Come January 3rd, Mr. O'Reilly will appear as Santa again in a more fully developed picture of the American gift bringer. Tom Nast is doing his portrait on the front page of Harper's Weekly. "So you really did present something the world has never before seen," she said. And Mrs. Macy stretched out her hand to her husband, and upon taking it, she guided him next to her on the sofa. Once settled, side by side on the sofa, facing the warm fire, she looked over at her husband and said, "Merry Christmas, my dear. Merry Christmas." You who've been watching all these stories these past few weeks, from the Landmark Center here in St. Paul, Merry Christmas.